Before we begin, a necessary statement. This video is a critical macroeconomic analysis of Canadian monetary policy, historical data, and central banking mechanic. It relies on public data provided by the Bank of Canada and Statistics Canada. It is not financial advice, nor is it a personal attack on any policymaker. It is an examination of a systemic financial structure. Viewer discretion is advised. Imagine it is late at night. The house is quiet, and the only light in the room is the harsh blue glow of your smartphone screen. You open your banking app. You look at the number glowing in the center of the screen, your life savings. Maybe that number is slightly higher today than it was 5 years ago. Maybe you received a modest raise at work. Maybe you managed to put away a few extra $100 this year. Logically, mathematically, you should feel a sense of security. You have more dollars, but you don't feel secure, do you? You feel a cold, creeping sense of dread. Every time you go to the grocery store, every time you pay a utility bill, every time you look at the terrifying price of a modest starter home, that number on your screen feels smaller. It feels weaker. It feels like sand slipping through your finger. You are working harder than you ever have in your life. You are playing by the rule. You are doing everything society told you to do. But no matter how fast you run, the finish line keeps moving further away. You are not going crazy, and you are not alone. You are experiencing the psychological symptoms of a dying currency. Welcome to the Northern Ledger. Today, we are investigating the most silent, most destructive wealth transfer in Canadian history. A theft so massive and so perfectly executed that the victims don't even realize they have been robbed. We are going to look past the political theater. We are going to open the central bank's ledger, and we are going to expose the deliberate, calculated death of the Canadian dollar. To understand why you feel so incredibly poor while working so incredibly hard, we have to fundamentally change how you look at a $20 bill. Most of us go through our entire lives without ever asking the most basic economic question: what is money? We treat it like a force of nature, like gravity or the weather. But it is not. A Canadian dollar has absolutely no intrinsic value. You cannot eat it. You cannot build a house with it. It does not keep you warm in the brutal winter. Fiat currency, paper money, is nothing more than a highly sophisticated accounting system. It is a societal illusion that we all collectively agree to believe in. When you go to work for 40 hours a week, you are trading your finite, irreplaceable human energy, your physical labor, and your time on this earth for a piece of paper. That paper is supposed to be a reliable battery. It is supposed to store your economic energy today so that you can safely spend it tomorrow. But what happens when the battery has a leak? What happens when the people who manufacture the batteries decide to secretly drain your energy to pay their own debts? This brings us to the scene of the crime, the printing press. In a sound, honest economy, money is finite. It represents actual, tangible goods and services. If a society produces 10 apples, and there are $10 in existence, each apple costs $1. If the government suddenly, magically, prints 10 more dollars, but the farmers don't grow any more apples, the society is not suddenly twice as rich. The price of the apple simply doubles to $2. The physical wealth of the society hasn't changed. The only thing that changed was the measuring stick. The currency was diluted. Now, let's look at what the central planners did to your measuring stick. In the early months of 2020, a global crisis provided the perfect cover for the greatest monetary expansion in our nation's history. The government decided to shut down the physical economy, but they still needed to pay for everything. They needed billions of dollars they simply did not have. They couldn't raise your income taxes high enough to cover the bill without triggering a massive social revolt. So they did what desperate empires have always done throughout history. They turned to the central bank. They turned on the printing press. They gave it a polite, complicated academic name to keep you from panicking. They called it quantitative easing. But do not let the financial jargon fool you. it was counterfeiting on a sovereign scale. We don't have to guess about the scale of this dilution. We just have to look at the official, audited data. According to the Bank of Canada's own published balance sheet, at the beginning of 2020, the total assets held by the central bank were roughly $120 billion. It took them nearly a century of Canadian economic history to responsibly reach that number. But over the next 2 years, the Bank of Canada artificially created hundreds of billions of new dollars out of thin air to buy government debt. By early 2021, their balance sheet had violently exploded to nearly $600 billion, a nearly 500% expansion in a matter of months. Let that sink in. They effectively flooded the Canadian economy with hundreds of billions of new unearned currency units. But they didn't build any new homes, they didn't grow any new wheat, they didn't drill any new oil. They just printed more paper claims on the exact same pool of real physical assets. Think of the Canadian economy as a massive pot of soup meant to feed 40 million people. In 2020, the government realized there wasn't enough meat and potatoes to go around. Instead of finding more food, they just dumped hundreds of gallons of boiling water into the pot and proudly declared to the public that there was now enough soup for everyone. Yes, the physical volume increased. Yes, the nominal numbers on your banking app got slightly bigger. But the nutritional value, the actual physical purchasing power of your money, was completely destroyed. Your life savings, the physical energy you stored in that fiat battery for decades, was violently diluted to pay for the government's debts. You were robbed without anyone ever breaking into your house. But a systemic theft of this unprecedented magnitude requires a massive cover-up. If the public truly understood that their money was losing its value at a terrifying rate, there would be a panic. The illusion would break. So the architects of this system needed a smokescreen. They needed a metric that looked official, sounded highly scientific, and consistently told the public that everything was perfectly fine. Which brings us to the greatest, most enduring lie in modern economic. But a systemic theft of this unprecedented magnitude requires a massive cover-up. If the public truly understood that their money was losing its purchasing power at a terrifying compounding rate, there would be an immediate panic. The illusion of the currency would break. So, the architects of this financial system needed a smokescreen. They needed a metric that looked highly official, sounded rigorously scientific, and consistently told the struggling public that everything was perfectly fine. Which brings us to the greatest, most enduring lie in modern macroeconomic policy, the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. If you watch the nightly news or listen to the Minister of Finance or read the press releases from the Bank of Canada, you will hear them talk about the CPI constantly. They will stand at a podium and proudly declare, "We are successfully fighting inflation." The CPI is only up 3% this year. We have achieved a soft landing. And you, sitting in your living room, staring at a grocery receipt that has doubled, and a hydro bill that has spiked, and a rent notice that is destroying your budget, feel like you are losing your mind. How can the government officially claim that the cost of living has only gone up by 3% when your everyday reality feels like it has gone up by 30%? You are not crazy. You are the victim of mathematical gaslighting. The CPI is widely presented to the public as a reliable thermometer for the cost of living. But it is not. It is a highly manipulated, carefully curated basket of goods and services designed by government bureaucrats to vastly understate the true rate of monetary debasement. Let's look at how the magic trick is performed. It relies on a bureaucratic sleight of hand called substitution bias. Statistics Canada will tell you they are simply updating their formulas to reflect real consumer choices. They argue that if a premium cut of beef gets too expensive, the rational Canadian consumer will simply stop buying it and substitute it with something cheaper, like chicken or ground pork. So, they quietly remove the expensive beef from the inflation calculation, replace it with the cheaper chicken, and announce to the public, "Look, food inflation is stable." They hide behind academic methodology. The spreadsheet looks mathematically perfect. The politicians get to claim victory, but look at what actually happened to your life. Your standard of living was violently downgraded. You are eating worse food. You have been priced out of the protein you used to enjoy. The inflation didn't disappear. It was just hidden by forcing you to accept a lower quality of life. And they don't stop at food. They use another academic justification called hedonic quality adjustment. If the price of a new television stays the same, but the screen gets slightly larger and sharper this year, the government statisticians will actually record that as a price drop in the CPI. They argue that because you are getting more value for the same money, the effective price went down. They use the deflationary power of modern technology, better TVs, faster computers, cheaper cell phones, to mask and drag down the terrifying inflationary increases in the things you actually need to survive, like food, energy, and shelter. You cannot eat a flat-screen television. You cannot live inside an iPad. But the darkest, most destructive manipulation of the CPI is how they handle the basic human need for shelter. This is the ultimate betrayal of the Canadian working class. According to the historical data and methodology from Statistics Canada, the CPI completely fails to capture the true explosive cost of purchasing a home. When they calculate the shelter component of inflation, they don't use the actual, terrifying market price of buying a house. Instead, they use a convoluted formula that includes mortgage interest costs, property taxes, and something called homeowner's replacement cost. Look at the devastating disconnect this creates. Over the last decade, the actual market price of a detached home or a condominium in major Canadian markets doubled, or in some cases tripled. The cost of a down payment became a mathematically impossible hurdle for an entire generation of young Canadians. The fundamental Canadian dream was destroyed. Yet, during that exact same period of explosive historic asset inflation, the official CPI housing component barely registered a fraction of that reality. They completely stripped the actual, real-world cost of acquiring the asset out of the inflation equation. Why would the government go to such incredible lengths to hide the true rate of inflation? Why manipulate the basket? Because the CPI is not just a harmless statistic. It is a weapon. If the government admitted that real, everyday inflation was running at 10 or 15%, they would be forced to massively increase the payouts for the Canada Pension Plan. They would be forced to pay significantly higher interest rates on their massive national debt. Labor unions would demand massive wage increases to keep up with reality. The entire sovereign debt structure would collapse under the weight of the truth. So they lie. They change the formula. They tell you inflation is defeated, while your purchasing power bleeds out in the street. If the central bank printed hundreds of billions of new dollars out of thin air, and that newly created money didn't officially show up in the manipulated CPI, where did it actually go? Who got their hands on all that new wealth? And crucially, why did they get it before you did? To answer that, we have to look at an economic principle discovered over 250 years ago by an Irish-French economist named Richard Cantillon. It is a concept so utterly destructive to the working class and so highly profitable for the financial elite that it is rarely taught in modern universities. It is called the Cantillon Effect. Here is the dark, mechanical truth of fiat currency expansion. When the Bank of Canada creates hundreds of billions of new dollars, they do not divide that money equally and mail a check to every single Canadian citizen. That is not how the system works. The new money enters the economy through the absolute top of the financial pyramid. The central bank injects this newly created liquidity directly into massive financial institutions, commercial banks, and primary dealers by purchasing government bonds and mortgage-backed securities from them. These massive, elite institutions get the brand new money first, and this sequence is everything. When the banks and the mega-corporations receive this massive influx of fresh, newly printed capital at near-zero interest rates, general inflation hasn't happened yet. The new money hasn't circulated into the broader economy. So what does the smart money do? They do not put it in a savings account. They immediately use that cheap, undiluted capital to buy up finite, hard assets. They buy prime commercial real estate. They buy residential housing portfolio. They buy massive amounts of equities in the stock market. And corporations use the cheap debt to execute massive stock buyback program. Because billions of new dollars are suddenly chasing the exact same amount of finite assets, the prices of those assets absolutely explode. This is the exact reason why, during a global economic shutdown where nothing was being produced, the Canadian housing market and the global stock markets shattered historical records. It wasn't organic economic growth. It was a massive, artificial injection of newly printed fiat currency pooling at the top of the pyramid. Now, look at the bottom of the pyramid. Look at the Canadian working class. By the time that newly printed money finally trickles down to the everyday citizen, perhaps in the form of a heavily taxed 3% annual wage increase or a minor government stimulus check, the damage has already been done. The elite have already bid up the price of everything. By the time the worker gets their 3% raise, the cost of a starter home has surged by 40%, and the cost of basic groceries has surged by 20%. The Cantillon Effect is not a glitch. It is a perfect, silent, highly efficient mechanism for transferring purchasing power from the people who work for a wage, directly to the people who own the assets and sit closest to the money printer. It is a regressive, invisible tax on the poor and the middle class, designed to actively fund the asset appreciation of the wealthy. But a vital question remains: why would the government actively participate in this? Why would they deliberately dilute their own national currency and crush their own citizens' standard of living? The answer is simple and mathematically terrifying. They are trapped. They are caught in the sovereign debt trap. For decades, politicians across the political spectrum have made impossible financial promises to the public in order to win elections. They promised massive social programs, expanded bureaucracies, and endless infrastructure spending without ever raising taxes high enough to actually pay for it. Instead, they borrowed. They borrowed on a scale that is difficult for the human brain to comprehend. We do not have to speculate about the severity of this crisis. The numbers are publicly available, though rarely discussed on the evening news. According to official, audited data from the Department of Finance, the Canadian federal gross debt has now violently exploded past $1.2 trillion. $1.2 trillion. When a nation owes that much money, standard economics completely breaks down. If interest rates rise even slightly to fight inflation, the government literally cannot afford to pay the interest on its own debt without cutting essential services or massively raising your income taxes. Both of those options are political suicide. They cannot tax you enough because the middle class is already financially exhausted. And they cannot officially default on the debt because that would trigger an instantaneous, catastrophic collapse of the entire domestic banking system. So they choose the third option, the coward's option, the hidden option. They use financial repression. They deliberately inflate the debt away. Here is the ultimate magic trick of the fiat system. The government borrows $1 billion today when the dollar is strong and has high purchasing power. Then, over the next 10 years, they order the central bank to aggressively print more money, deliberately destroying the value of the currency. When it comes time to pay the debt back, they pay it back with newly printed dollars that are practically worthless. The numerical value of the debt stays the same, but the true economic weight of the debt is completely erased. They successfully steal the difference. But who pays for that difference? Who actually absorbs the loss? You do. Anyone holding Canadian dollars in a checking account. Anyone saving for a down payment. Anyone living on a fixed pension. You are paying the government's trillion-dollar debt through the silent, compounding destruction of your purchasing power. You are bleeding out financially so that the system can survive one more election cycle. But the most sophisticated players in the world, the billionaires, the massive hedge funds, the elite investors, they know exactly how this game is played. They see the death of the fiat currency coming from a mile away, and they are aggressively preparing for the end. The most dangerous lie you were ever told by the financial establishment is that saving your money makes you responsible. For generations, the Canadian working class was raised on a fundamental moral economic principle. Go to school, get a good job, live below your means, and put your excess Canadian dollars into a high-yield savings account. Do that, and you will eventually build wealth. You will be saved. In a sound money system backed by gold or physical reality, that advice was true. But in a fiat system driven by endless debt monetization, that advice is financial suicide. When you leave your life savings in a checking account or lock it into a government bond paying 4%, you are participating in a rigged game. If real, everyday inflation, the actual cost of your groceries, your energy, and your housing, is running at 10 or 15%, your 4% interest rate is not a return on investment. It is a slaughter. You are locking in a guaranteed, compounding, negative, real return. You are slowly, mathematically bleeding to death while the bank tells you that you are making money. The savers are the ultimate losers in a fiat economy. The people who designed this system know this. The central bankers know this. And the apex predators of the financial world, the billionaires and the institutional titans, they understand this math perfectly. Look at the behavior of the most disciplined capital on earth. Look at Warren Buffett. The media loves to present him as a calm, grandfatherly investor who simply buys great companies and waits forever. But when you look past the myth and examine the balance sheet, a different signal appears. Over the last few years, Berkshire Hathaway has built one of the largest cash positions in its history. Hundreds of billions of dollars, much of it parked in short-term treasury bills. That is not the posture of a man intoxicated by current market prices. That is the posture of a man who sees very little margin for error. And that distinction matters. Buffett's cash buildup does not prove that tomorrow morning the system collapses. It does not mean he is predicting the end of the world. But it does tell you something important. Even some of the most patient, rational, battle-tested capital in modern financial history appears deeply uncomfortable with current valuations. Why? Because when markets are inflated by years of cheap money, suppressed rates, and excess liquidity, price stops being a reliable signal of value. Assets rise, multiples expand, and paper wealth multiplies. But much of that prosperity is built on monetary distortion, not productive reality. So the disciplined investor waits. He preserves liquidity. He protects optionality. He refuses to overpay for assets inflated by a tide of artificial money. And when the cycle turns, as every artificial cycle eventually does, cash stops looking lazy. Cash becomes strategic power. That is how sophisticated capital survives a distorted market. It does not chase euphoria. It waits for dislocation. It waits for forced selling. It waits for reality to reprice the illusion. And when that moment arrives, the people with liquidity will not be the ones panicking. They will be the ones buying. That is the part ordinary people are never taught. When the middle class is fully invested at inflated prices, when their savings are already trapped inside overpriced assets, and when a tightening cycle finally breaks the spell, they do not have dry powder. They do not have optionality. They become sellers at the exact moment the patient capital becomes buyers. That is how wealth concentration accelerates in the late stages of a fiat cycle. Not through one dramatic act of theft, but through timing, liquidity, and the brutal advantage of being able to wait while everyone else is forced to move. So, what is the escape hatch? When the Canadian loonie is systematically engineered to lose its value, where do the wealthy hide? They abandon the paper and they flee to physical reality. They flee to hard asset. They flee to sound money. When fiat currencies die, and historically, every single unbacked fiat currency eventually drops to its intrinsic value of zero, humanity always, inevitably, returns to finite scarcity. The elite buy productive agricultural land. They buy energy infrastructure. And most importantly, they hoard the ultimate historical destroyers of fiat currency: precious metals. Look at the global central bank. While they tell the public that inflation is transitory and that their paper money is perfectly safe, what are they actually doing behind closed doors? Over the last 3 years, central banks around the world have been quietly purchasing and hoarding physical gold at record, unprecedented levels. They are dumping each other's debt, and they are buying the only financial asset on Earth that cannot be printed, cannot be hacked, and cannot be diluted by a desperate politician facing an election year. Gold and silver are not just shiny rock. They are a physical ledger of human energy that cannot be manipulated by the Bank of Canada. They are the financial insurance policy against the arrogance of central planners. The elite are securing their wealth in hard, undeniable reality. Meanwhile, they encourage you to keep your wealth stored in digital illusions on a banking app. This brings us to the endgame: the hard reset. The Canadian dollar is no longer a reliable battery for your economic energy. It is a melting ice cube, designed to evaporate in your hands to pay for the sins and the debts of a bloated, broken government. You cannot vote your way out of mathematical certainty. You cannot write a strongly worded letter to the Minister of Finance to stop the printing press. The sovereign debt trap has already snapped shut, but you can refuse to be the victim. You can refuse to be the battery that powers their corrupt machine. It is time to wake up from the fiat illusion. It is time to stop measuring your wealth, your success, and your future in a currency that is actively being weaponized against you. Protect your labor. Protect your energy. Move your life savings out of the blast zone of the printing press and anchor it to the physical, finite world. Anchor it to hard asset. The death of the Loonie is not a future event. It is happening right now in real time every time you tap your card at the checkout counter. The wealth of a nation is being transferred into the shadows. Do not let them take yours. This has been the Northern Ledger. Thank you for watching.